Well, I am halfway between Port Vila in Vanuatu and Noumea in New Caledonia. So I was going to give you an introduction to what we have on TinTin. So this is the primary unit that I have on TinTin. Now it is connected, it replaced an old Neco unit, which you'll see, and it's a Chinese Autopilot. I bought it because it was compatible with my Neco motor that drives the quadrant. So it's a chain-driven motor, or motor that drives a chain to the quadrant, and this unit had proven to be quite compatible with it. It's also quite affordable, so I was looking at upgrading, and my old Neco unit, which I loved, which was an analog system, about 50 years old, you know, it's a beautiful Autopilot, you know, like really smooth, used a lot of power, but this doesn't use much less because whilst the head unit doesn't use much, the motor is still a bit heavy on power. But it works quite well. It's very simple. The only downside was it's not 100% waterproof, which I found out. So it's in an enclosure where I can protect it from the weather. A little bit rudimentary, does the job though. Alright, so that's my primary unit. And this is my wheel pilot. So I have a wheel pilot which I put on the boat when I first bought the boat, and my Neco wasn't 100% reliable. So I have a Raymarine Evo 100, and this works okay in light conditions like today. It's, you know, it's blowing 10 knots, the seas are flat. It'll steer this boat all day without any problems. Uses about 3 to 4 amps an hour, which is pretty light on. Very simple. All you do is, you know, push the lever down, press auto, and it's steering the boat. So it's got quite an advanced compass and it does a good job. Then I have a windvane. So I have an Aries windvane. So it's attached, and the steering lines are attached to the wheel, which is how it steers the boat, by this little device, which is, you undo this and it free spins, do this up, and it locks the wheel. So at the moment it is driving the boat, and how that works is, you know, at the moment it's a mechanical system. You can see it down there. It's a servo pendulum. This is like a 50-year-old windvane, which I rebuilt at the start of last year in Nelson at Anchor Engineering in New Zealand. So I can put a blade on it and I can steer it with the wind, but it doesn't steer that well when the wind is behind the beam or from the stern. So I was experimenting with putting a electrical mechanical device on. So this is a very simple tiller pilot from Raymarine. They're about $700 Australian. It's not very powerful, it's like designed for a trailer sailor, but all it has to do is move that vane, and that vane you could move with your little pinky. In fact, your child can move with a little pinky. It's very light. And so I've been playing around with it for a while, and originally I had it coming from this position here going out. That didn't really work. Then I tried it from this position down here going out. Didn't work. It would steer a course but it would lose direction. And then I decided I better put it how it was designed to go. So I put it off to the side, and it seems to hold a course pretty well. So my boat, I've got a post out the back here, so I put a bracket on there, and this is only a recent bracket, it's a little bit rudimentary. And it just drops in, and then I attach it to the vane. I've just got a shackle which I put through, and that locks into the top of the vane, and then I have a pin that goes through which keeps the whole mechanism tidy and allows it to move on an axis. So as that vane moves, it then moves that arm that goes up and down. It then moves that vane in the water, or the rudder in the water. So the rudder gets moved left and right by the movement on the vane at the top. And as that moves left and right, the hydrodynamic forces push that arm from left and right. And they're massive forces, so they can steer this boat in the most severe conditions. And that is by the lines coming off the bottom of that tiller back to the wheel. And the worse it blows, the better this thing works. So why have I put an electronic pilot onto my Aries wind vane? So on a day like today, I could be using the Aries wind vane. It would work fine. But I wanted to have it work in all conditions, because the benefit of having the tiller pilot is it uses very little power. It uses about 1 amp, maybe 2 amps of power, so it's not very much. And by using very little power, I'm saving batteries. That's the benefit of using a wind vane. Like if you're just using the vane by itself, you're not using any power to steer your boat. But I want to be able to use this thing going downwind, and I hadn't been able to use it effectively. And I've been using my main autopilot. When I'm going downwind in heavy conditions, it'll use 10 amps because it's working quite hard, whereas this is using 1 to 2 amps. So, and the other thing I look at is I want redundancy. So I've got my main autopilot, which is electronic. I've got a backup autopilot, which is electronic. I've got a wind vane, which is manual. And now I've got another means of controlling my wind vane, which is electrical mechanical. And that gives me layers of redundancy. Some people just carry one wind vane or one autopilot, and they have spare parts, lots of spare parts to make it work. These things all break down. And I haven't used the small tiller pilot enough, and I know it's not getting worked very hard. I just don't know the duty cycle, whether it can handle being used for days and weeks on end. That'll be something I find out. The wind vane, I've actually ripped that off the back of the boat twice in massive storms. It's come loose. It just started to move, it ripped the mounts, and I was literally towing it behind the boat because it's bloody heavy to get on and it's impossible to pick up in a storm. So I had lots of ropes on it, just sort of almost towing it behind the boat until I could get into a calm weather or into a bay. The wheel pilot, they're not very strong. They're not suitable to drive a boat like this in anything other than calm conditions, because the motors will wear out, or the belts will snap, and or they'll break the gearbox. They're quite weak and not a fantastic item at all. I think it's a pretty poor product by Ray Marine. The main autopilot has proven to be quite good. Occasionally in really heavy conditions, when this boat is under full sail, thumping along, particularly after the wind after the beam, I will blow fuses occasionally, and that's normally an indicator to me that I should be reducing sail. It doesn't happen very often. It's like once or twice in 6 years, but I'm probably overpowering the boat, and I think that's the key with autopilots or wind vanes. Is as the weather, the wind increases, weather deteriorates, you have to reef. You need to. If you're not a racing sailor, we have the massively powerful autopilots and over-engineered steering system and powerful rig. You need to reef. And the more you reef, put a few reefs in the main, and reduce a bit of sail area. You reduce the strain on your autopilot and on your wind vane. And on this boat, if I put 3 reefs in the main, reef in the mizzen, furl a bit of the head sail, or run the storm jib, my tiller pilot, or my wheel pilot, can steer this boat quite comfortably. And it's just because it's not getting worked too hard. So yeah, that's my strategy for running my autopilots. And because I do solo sail, I like to have layers of redundancy. I talked to a number of solo sailors and sailors in general, and one of the biggest problems people have, particularly if they're short-handed or sailing with a couple, is they don't have any redundancy in the autopilots. They have one autopilot, and if you've got one autopilot, you should at least have two rams. Either a massively oversized ram and a spare, or two rams that are opposing, so they're doing half the work. And there's various ways to do it, but I think when you're putting these things together, your autopilots, you need to over-spec everything. Like, if you've got a 20-ton boat, spec it for a 40-ton boat, because the conditions, sometimes terrible. Sea conditions can be horrendous, and that puts massive strain on your autopilots. And these things are getting worked for days, weeks, months on end. Imagine a Pacific crossing where you're just running this thing every day, 24 hours a day for 6 months. It is getting a lot of work, and that's where these things fail. So, my motor on my primary autopilot is a 50-year-old motor. It is massive compared to what they produce today. I was almost going to change that motor when I changed the Neco Autopilot, but I was chatting to a few people and they said these things are massively overspec'd. It was big enough to drive a small ship. So I kept it, I changed the bushes, I changed some oil, I replaced some of the electronics in it, which I will show you in a moment, and I put it back in, and apart from blowing the occasional fuse, it has worked flawlessly, and I expect it to work for another 50 years. I'm not sure about the head unit. The head unit is generally pretty reliable. I'm quite happy with it. It didn't cost a huge amount, and it is very simple. It's got GPS and compass fitted, and one of the reasons I went with that unit as opposed to looking at I was going to go with a Garmin unit because I have a Garmin chart plotter, was I wanted redundancy. If I had a Garmin system connected to my chart plotter and I got hit with a lightning or a major electrical fault, then potentially I'll lose my autopilot, and I didn't want that. So all of my autopilots are independent of each other. My main autopilot is independent of my chart plotter and my Numia 2000 system. My backup autopilot, which is my wheel pilot, is independent of my main autopilot. My other small tiller pilot on the windvane is also completely independent. They might share the 12-volt power source and a series of fuses, but if I blow a fuse, all I've got to do is replace a fuse. I've got fuses in series, and I can get going again. Or if worst case happens and I lose all my electronics from lightning, then I've got a windvane which will work without power. And that's one of the reasons I have the tiller pilot, because I can, most of the time it's not on the boat, not on the actual windvane, it's in a cupboard. So it's sort of a spare of a spare of a spare, and that's how I think when I'm sailing. Boats do get hit by lightning. I've been hit by lightning before, or only a mild touch, but it's still, it still gives the boat a bit of a shake-up. And I read stories of people who've been hit, a hard hit with lightning, and a mate of mine had all of his electronics fried, solar panels, batteries, electronics, chart plotters, autopilots, radios, everything was fried. It's also one of the reasons why I carry several charting devices. I have, a phone with navionics on it, a tablet with navionics on it. I have a old-fashioned small charting GPS with world charts on it, and then I have my primary chart plotter. And you could lose your primary chart plotter, but you've got layers of redundancy. And then I have paper charts as well, and I still plot as I'm sailing. Like today I'm sailing from Port Vila to Namibia. We still, every 6 hours we put a plot down where we are on the chart and in our logbook. So if we lose our electronics for some reason, we know where we are. We can keep going old school and set a compass bearing and off we go. So but back to the main focus is autopilots. That's what we have on TinTin. That's why we have it on TinTin. everybody has a different opinion. Some people don't give a lot of thought, you know, they just sail in the boat, they've got the one, and they hope that it works. But you'd be amazed the amount of people I meet in the islands who have lost their autopilot, you know, a couple of days into a trip from New Zealand to Tonga, or New Zealand to Fiji, New Zealand to Vanuatu, and they are hand steering for the rest of that trip. You know, unless they can jig up a, you know, some bungee cord and a improvised, you know, autopilot. Because most of these new boats don't have windvanes; they have one autopilot, and if you're running a thing like something like a cat, it's a bit more difficult to do that. You know, on a whole, you can improvise self-steering in many cases. Like TinTin, if I debrief everything, I can almost get this boat to point without any steering aids. So often I've found in the middle of a gale, I'm debriefed, you know, punching along with the windvane on, and the windvane will undo itself with a little knob that connects it to the wheel, and it hasn't been connected for hours, and we're still holding a perfect course. It's just because this boat in heavy weather can hold a course deep reefed. It's different when I put all the sail up. It won't hold a course to save itself, but fully reefed down in heavy conditions, it'll hold a course all day long, particularly, you know, anything forward to the beam. It tends to be quite comfortable. So yeah, just something to think about. If you're going to buy a boat, you're going to set it up, you know, you either set up a primary autopilot with lots of spares, you know, a spare head unit, maybe a spare motherboard, and definitely a spare drive unit. Like, you need to have a spare drive unit, you know, particularly, you know, the Raymarine stuff, like those linear drives. I see so many people, their linear drives fail. I don't think they're the best product, and I think often they're under-specced. So if you over-spec it, you'll have a chance that it'll survive. But you still need to carry a spare. And a linear drive for this boat would be $5,000. So carrying around another $5,000 linear drive seems ludicrous. Whereas putting a $10,000 or, you know, $7,000 windvane on the back of your boat seems logical, because you can use that when you're sailing. You can sail downwind. They don't work so well on cats, so, you know, it becomes a problem. You know, some of the newer boats, they might not work, but they'll generally steer most monohulls. So it's something you can consider, is having some spare parts for your primary autopilot and having a windvane. It's an older methodology, but more and more cruising boats have them. They have them for a good reason, because they work. You know, mine is ancient. You know, it's over 50 years old, but it still works as good as the day it was made, and I rebuilt it last year. There's a company opened up in Amsterdam, remanufacturing these under license, or under the old license, I think. So yeah, windvanes. There's dozens of different types. You've got to find one that you like, that suits your boat. It's reliable and strong, and it's something to consider. But that's my thoughts on autopilots and windvanes. Safe sailing, and I'll see you out there.